An arrogant millionaire feared in the business world spent 5 years trapped in a deep coma. When his family decided to turn off the machines, a mysterious poor boy entered the hospital and did the impossible. The miraculous encounter not only brought the businessman back to life, but also revealed a devastating secret about his past. Now, with time running out, he must radically change who he is before it's too late. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The Manhattan skyline glittered against the evening sky as Richard Blackwood's private helicopter descended toward the helipad atop the Blackwood Tower. Below him stretched the kingdom he had built through ruthless determination and an iron will that crushed anyone who stood in his way. At 52, Richard was at the pinnacle of his power, CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, one of the largest conglomerates in America, with holdings in technology, real estate, and media. The board meeting earlier that day had been particularly satisfying. He had publicly humiliated Marcus Jenkins, the marketing director, reducing the man to tears in front of his colleagues for a minor error in a presentation. Richard smiled at the memory. Fear was a powerful motivator, and no one inspired fear quite like he did. As the helicopter landed, his assistant Caroline rushed forward, tablet in hand, her expression tight with anxiety. At 35, she had survived longer than most in Richard's employ, having developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his needs and tolerate his mercurial temperament. "Mr. Blackwood," your wife called. "She wanted to remind you about your son's piano recital tonight." Richard scoffed, checking his Patek Philippe watch. "Tell her I have the Anderson deal to close. Timothy will have plenty more recitals." Caroline's eyes flickered with disapproval before she carefully masked her expression. "The recital starts in 20 minutes, sir. Your son is playing the opening piece." "Did I stutter, Caroline? The Anderson deal is worth $2.3 billion. I'm sure my 12-year-old will understand that Daddy had to secure his inheritance." He brushed past her, striding toward his private elevator. "Also, sir," Caroline continued, hurrying to keep pace, "Mr. Harrington called about the waterfront project. The environmental impact report revealed significant issues with the proposed site." Richard stopped abruptly, causing Caroline to nearly collide with him. "Tell Harrington to bury the report. Pay off whoever needs paying off. That property is too valuable to let some endangered fish or whatever get in our way." "Sir, that would be illegal." "That's why we have lawyers, Caroline," Richard cut her off coldly. "Make it happen." Inside his office, Richard loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of 30-year-old scotch. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he felt he owned. He had clawed his way up from upper-middle-class suburbia to become one of the most powerful men in New York, and he'd left countless broken careers and relationships in his wake. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Elizabeth. "Timothy asked if you were coming. I don't know what to tell him anymore." Richard deleted the message without responding. Elizabeth had known what she was getting into when she married him. She enjoyed the benefits of his wealth and power. She could handle the downsides. The intercom buzzed, and Caroline's voice filled the room. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Chen from Horizon Tech is on line 1. Richard smiled. Horizon Tech was a promising startup he had been eyeing for acquisition, or rather, for dismantling and absorbing its most valuable assets while discarding the rest, including its founder, Linda Chen. "Linda, how wonderful to hear from you," he greeted with false warmth. "Mr. Blackwood," Linda's voice was tense, "I'm calling about your latest offer. It's significantly lower than what we discussed last week." "Market conditions change, Linda. My analysts believe your valuation was optimistic." "This isn't what we agreed on," Linda's voice hardened. "We shook hands on the original figure." Richard laughed softly. "A handshake isn't a contract, Linda. Business is business. Take the offer or watch your company run out of runway in 6 months. Your choice." After hanging up, Richard felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came from exercising his power. He had Linda Chen exactly where he wanted her, desperate and with few options. By next week, Horizon Tech would be his on his terms. The evening. Stretched ahead of him, calls to make, strategies to plan, competitors to crush. Timothy's recital was long forgotten, as Richard lost himself in the work that had consumed his life. Hours later, as midnight approached, Richard finally headed home to his penthouse apartment on Park Avenue. The doorman greeted him with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Even his building staff feared him. His apartment was dark and silent. Elizabeth had left a note on the kitchen counter. "Timothy was amazing tonight. He got a standing ovation. He looked for you in the audience. The entire time." Richard crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. He'd make it up to the boy with some expensive gift tomorrow. That always worked. The next morning dawned bright and cold. Richard was already on his treadmill by 5 a.m., pushing himself through a punishing workout while reviewing quarterly reports on the screen in front of him. Physical discipline was as important as mental discipline in his philosophy of success. By 7 a.m. he was in his office, already barking orders at his executive team via video conference. "The Singapore numbers are pathetic. I want Johnson replaced by the end of the day. And someone get me those projections for the Anderson deal. I needed them yesterday." Caroline entered with his usual breakfast, black coffee and a protein shake, and a stack of documents requiring his signature. "Your wife called again," she said hesitantly. "She asked if you'd be home for dinner tonight. It's your anniversary." Richard didn't even look up from the papers he was reviewing. "Send flowers, expensive ones, and make a reservation at that French place she likes for next weekend. Tell her I'll make it up to her." Caroline nodded, her expression carefully neutral as she left his office. The day proceeded like most others in Richard Blackwood's life, a series of meetings where he dominated the room, business calls where he manipulated and intimidated, and decisions that prioritized profit above all else, including human cost. By late afternoon, he had fired 3 employees, threatened a supplier with legal action unless they lowered their prices, and finalized the predatory acquisition of Horizon Tech, ensuring that Linda Chen would walk away with a fraction of what her company was worth. As evening approached, Richard prepared to meet with James Anderson to close their deal over dinner. The Anderson portfolio would be the crown jewel in Blackwood Enterprises' recent acquisitions, and Richard was determined to finalize the terms tonight. He stepped into the elevator, punching the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, Caroline rushed forward with a document in hand. "Sir, you need to sign this before your dinner." Richard held the door with an impatient sigh. As Caroline handed him the document, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Richard saw what had been carefully hidden beneath her professional demeanor: utter contempt. The realization sent an unexpected jolt through him. When had everyone around him started to despise him so thoroughly? Had it always been this way? The moment passed, and Richard dismissed the thought. What did it matter if people hated him as long as they feared and obeyed him? He signed the document and handed it back to Caroline without a word. The elevator doors closed, and Richard descended toward the lobby, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. Outside, the evening air was unseasonably warm as Richard stepped into his waiting town car. His driver, Michael, a stoic man who had worked for him for nearly a decade, pulled smoothly into the heavy Manhattan traffic. "The Four Seasons, sir," Michael confirmed. "Yes, and step on it. I don't want to keep Anderson waiting." As the car navigated through the crowded streets, Richard's phone rang. It was Elizabeth. For a moment he considered ignoring the call, but something, perhaps that fleeting moment of self-awareness in the elevator, made him answer. "I'm on my way to dinner with Anderson," he said curtly. "Richard," Elizabeth's voice was tight with anger. "Do you even remember what today is?" "Of course I do. I sent flowers." 15 years, Richard. 15 years of marriage, and you send flowers with a card your assistant probably signed." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. "I'm making reservations for us next weekend. That French place you like." "I don't want dinner next weekend," Elizabeth's voice cracked. "I want a husband who remembers what matters. Timothy hasn't seen you in weeks. I barely recognize you anymore." "I'm building an empire for you and Timothy," Richard snapped. "Everything I do is for this family." "No," Elizabeth said quietly. "Everything you do is for yourself." The call ended and Richard stared at his phone, a flicker of unease passing through him. He pushed it aside. Elizabeth would calm down. She always did. As the car approached an intersection near Central Park, the traffic light turned yellow. Michael began to slow, but Richard leaned forward impatiently. "Just go through it, we're already late." Michael hesitated, but then accelerated through the changing light. They were halfway through the intersection when a delivery truck barreling down the cross street ran its red light. Richard saw the truck's headlights for only a split second before impact. There was a deafening crash, the screech of metal against metal, and then the world began to spin as the town car was thrown violently across the intersection. In those final moments of consciousness, as the car rolled and glass shattered around him, time seemed to slow. Richard Blackwood, the man who believed he owned the world, suddenly faced the terrifying reality that he controlled nothing at all. 5 years passed like a whisper in the sterile quiet of room 1142 at New York Presbyterian Hospital. The once imposing Richard Blackwood now lay motionless, a living ghost tethered to machines that breathed for him, fed him, and measured the faint electrical impulses of a brain that showed no signs of awakening. The private room had been transformed into something between a medical facility and a shrine. Elizabeth had spared no expense. The best specialists, experimental treatments, round-the-clock private nurses, and equipment so advanced it wasn't yet available in most hospitals. On this particular morning, Dr. Sophia Reynolds studied the latest EEG readings with a practiced eye. After 5 years as Richard's neurologist, she had grown accustomed to delivering the same grim update to Elizabeth Blackwood, though the words never became easier to say. Elizabeth entered the room precisely at 10 a.m. as she did every Tuesday and Friday. At 45, she remained elegant and composed, though fine lines of exhaustion had permanently etched themselves around her eyes. Behind her walked Timothy, now 17, tall and solemn with his father's sharp features softened by his mother's gentle eyes. "Good morning, Dr. Reynolds," Elizabeth said, placing fresh flowers by the bedside. "Any changes?" Sophia shook her head. "I'm afraid not, Elizabeth. The latest round of treatments hasn't produced any measurable response." Elizabeth nodded, having expected this answer. She took Richard's pale, atrophied hand in hers, stroking it gently. His once tan skin had faded to an alabaster white, and the powerful physique that had commanded boardrooms was now wasted away despite the physical therapy the nurses performed daily. "And the new specialist from Sweden?" Elizabeth asked. "Has he reviewed the case?" "Dr. Lindstrom's assessment arrived this morning," Sophia replied carefully. "He concurs with our findings. The damage to Richard's brain stem from the accident was extensive. The fact that he's maintained minimal brain function for this long is actually remarkable." Timothy moved to the window, keeping his back to his father's bed. "How much longer?" "Are we going to do this, Mum?" he asked quietly, his voice deeper now than when the accident had occurred when he was still a child. Elizabeth looked at her son with a mixture of sympathy and determination. "As long as there's hope, Timothy." "Is there, though?" Timothy turned, his expression a complex mixture of grief, anger, and resignation. "It's been 5 years. 5 years of watching machines keep him alive. 5 years of specialists and treatments, and hopes that go nowhere. Your father is still with us," Elizabeth insisted, her voice firm, "and as long as he is, we won't give up on him." Timothy sighed, a sound too weary for a 17-year-old. "He wasn't even with us when he was conscious, Mum. He missed my recital that night to close a deal. He missed everything." Elizabeth didn't argue. The truth of her son's words hung heavy in the room. Richard Blackwood had been absent long before. The accident had stolen him away completely. Dr. Reynolds cleared her throat gently. "Elizabeth, I think it might be time to discuss long-term care options again. The hospital board has been asking questions about—" "I don't care what the board is asking," Elizabeth interrupted. "Money isn't an issue. Richard stays here." "It's not about money," Sophia said carefully. "It's about realistic expectations. The brain scans show increasing deterioration. Even if, against all medical probability, Richard were to wake up, he wouldn't be the same person. The damage is too severe." Elizabeth's composure cracked slightly. "You don't know that. You can't know that." "Mom," Timothy said gently, moving to her side. Maybe it's time we start thinking about what Dad would want. He wouldn't want to live like this, connected to machines, unable to control anything. That would be his worst nightmare. The room fell silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft hiss of the ventilator. Elizabeth looked at her husband's face, still handsome despite the hollowing of his cheeks and the pallor of prolonged unconsciousness. 2 more months, she finally said. The treatment from Japan starts next week. If there's no improvement after that, she couldn't finish the sentence. Dr. Reynolds nodded. That's reasonable, Elizabeth. We'll continue with the current protocol and incorporate the Japanese approach. But I think it's wise to prepare yourselves. After the doctor left, Elizabeth sat in the chair beside Richard's bed, still holding his hand. Timothy pulled another chair close to his mother. Do you remember when I was 9 and Dad took us sailing? Timothy asked suddenly. It was the summer before he started Blackwood Enterprises. Elizabeth smiled faintly. On Lake George, he rented that beautiful blue sailboat. He spent the whole day with us, Timothy continued. No phone calls, no business meetings, just the 3 of us on the water. He taught me how to read the wind. He was different before the company took off, Elizabeth said softly. More present. He still had that drive, that ambition, but it hadn't consumed him yet. What happened? To him, Mum? I mean, before the accident. What changed him? Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her husband's unresponsive face. Success changed him, or maybe it just revealed who he truly was. Each victory made him hunger for more. Each time he crushed a competitor, he grew more confident in his approach. Power became addictive to him. Did you ever think about leaving? Timothy asked hesitantly. Many times, Elizabeth admitted, but I always hoped the man I married was still in there somewhere. She squeezed Richard's limp hand. I'm still hoping. The weeks that followed brought no change to Richard's condition. The Japanese treatment, an experimental protocol involving neural stimulation, proved as ineffective as all the treatments before it. As the 2-month deadline approached, Elizabeth grew increasingly desperate, seeking opinions from specialists around the world, exploring alternative therapies, even consulting spiritual healers despite her usual pragmatism. Caroline Hamilton, still Richard's executive assistant after all these years, visited occasionally. Blackwood Enterprises had continued under the leadership of Victor Harrington, Richard's second in command, though the company had changed dramatically in his absence. The ruthless culture Richard had cultivated had intensified under Victor's guidance, with even more aggressive business practices and disregard for ethical considerations. The board meeting is tomorrow, Caroline informed Elizabeth during one visit. They're voting on whether to officially remove Richard as CEO and name Victor as his permanent replacement. Elizabeth nodded absently. Corporate politics seemed trivial compared to the decision she was facing regarding her husband's care. How are things at the company? She asked, more out of politeness than interest. Caroline hesitated. Different, harder in some ways. Victor has taken Richard's methods to extremes. I'm not surprised, Elizabeth replied. Richard always said Victor was the hungriest executive on his team, the most like him. No, Caroline said firmly. Victor is what Richard could have become if he'd continued down that path, but they're not the same. Richard had lines he wouldn't cross. Victor doesn't. The observation lingered with Elizabeth long after Caroline had gone. Had there still been humanity in Richard beneath the ruthless exterior, or was that just what she needed to believe? 2. Days before the end of the 2-month period, Dr. Reynolds called an urgent meeting with Elizabeth and Timothy. They gathered in a small conference room near Richard's hospital suite, joined by Dr. Martin Graves, the hospital's chief of neurology, and a legal representative from the hospital administration. I've asked you here today because we need to make some difficult decisions, Dr. Reynolds began gently. The latest comprehensive scans show continued deterioration in Richard's brain function. At this point, medical science has done everything possible. What are you saying? Elizabeth asked, though she already knew. Dr. Graves leaned forward, his expression compassionate but direct. "Mrs. Blackwood, we believe it's time to consider withdrawal of life support. Richard has been in a persistent vegetative state for 5 years, with no signs of improvement. The ethical and medical consensus is clear in cases like this." "You want me to let my husband go," Elizabeth said, her voice hollow. "We want you to consider what Richard would want," Dr. Reynolds corrected gently. "From everything you've told us about him, he was a man who valued control, strength, and independence." Timothy took his mother's hand. "Mom, I think they're right. Dad wouldn't want to exist like this. He wouldn't want us suspended in grief. Forever either." Elizabeth closed her eyes, tears finally breaking through her careful composure. "How would it happen?" The doctors explained the process, how the ventilator would be removed, how medication would ensure Richard felt no discomfort, how he would likely pass peacefully within hours. "I need time to think," Elizabeth said, rising from her chair. "Just a day or two." "Of course," Dr. Reynolds assured her. "This is entirely your decision, and we'll support whatever you choose." That night, Elizabeth sat alone in Richard's hospital room, the machines beeping their steady rhythm in the darkness. She spoke to him as she often did, unsure if any part of him could hear her words. "I don't know what to do, Richard," she whispered. "I've held on so long because letting go feels like failing you. But maybe holding on is the real failure. Not accepting what is, not allowing you dignity." She laid her head on the edge of his bed, exhaustion and grief finally overwhelming her. "Give me a sign," she murmured. "Anything to tell me what you want." Morning came with no sign, no miracle. Elizabeth met with Timothy for breakfast in Mainzeisendide, the hospital cafeteria, both of them hollow-eyed from sleepless nights. "I've made my decision," she told her son, her voice steady despite her reddened eyes. "It's time to let him go." Timothy nodded, reaching across the table to squeeze his mother's hand. "It's the right thing, Mum. Dad would understand." By afternoon, the paperwork was complete. The hospital chaplain had visited, and close family. Members had been notified. The procedure would take place the following morning at 10 a.m., giving everyone time to say their goodbyes. As twilight settled over the city, Elizabeth and Timothy sat vigil at Richard's bedside. Caroline had visited briefly, as had a few of Richard's oldest friends, though most of his social circle had drifted away over the years of his unconsciousness. "Remember that Christmas in Aspen?" Timothy asked, sharing memories as they had been doing all evening. "When Dad tried to cook breakfast and set off all the smoke alarms," Elizabeth laughed softly. "He was so determined to make those pancakes himself. No chef, no catering, just him in an apron making a disaster of the kitchen." "He wasn't always terrible," Timothy said quietly. "Just lost somehow." As night deepened outside the hospital, a nurse entered to check Richard's vitals one last time before the night shift change. She worked efficiently, recording numbers and adjusting equipment. "Try to get some rest," she advised Elizabeth gently. "Tomorrow will be difficult. I'll be just outside if you need anything." Elizabeth nodded gratefully, settling back into her chair for what would be her final night with Richard. Timothy had gone to get coffee from the cafeteria, promising to bring back something for his mother as well. The hospital corridor outside was quiet, most visitors having left for the night. The rhythmic sounds of the medical equipment created a familiar lullaby that had accompanied Elizabeth's vigil for 5 long years. She was drifting into an uneasy sleep when the door to Richard's room creaked open. Assuming it was Timothy returning, with coffee, Elizabeth didn't immediately look up. It was only when she heard light footsteps, too light to be her teenage son's, that she raised her head and saw something impossible. A boy stood at the foot of Richard's bed, small and thin, no more than 8 or 9 years old. He wore faded jeans and a grey hoodie that seemed too large for his frame. His sneakers were worn and dirty, his dark hair tousled as if he'd been running. But it was his eyes that struck Elizabeth most, deep blue and unnaturally intense, filled with a wisdom that seemed impossible for a child. "Who are you?" Elizabeth asked, rising from her chair. "How did you get in here?" The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to Richard's side, studying the unconscious man with solemn focus. "He's been like this a long time," the boy finally said, his voice soft but clear. Elizabeth reached for the call button beside the bed. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private room." "I can help him," the boy said simply, not looking up from Richard's face. Elizabeth's finger hesitated over the button. "What did you say?" "I can help him wake up." The boy finally turned those unsettling blue eyes toward her. "That's why I'm here." A mixture of emotions swept through Elizabeth. Confusion, indignation, and beneath it all a desperate flicker of hope she thought had been extinguished years ago. "Who are you?" she repeated. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The boy shook his head, impatience crossing his young face. "That doesn't matter right now. What matters is that tomorrow you're going to let him go, and it's not his time yet." Elizabeth felt a chill run through her. No one outside the immediate family and hospital staff knew about tomorrow's decision. "How could you possibly know that?" Instead of answering, the boy placed his small hand on Richard's arm. "He was a bad person, wasn't he, before the accident?" The blunt assessment startled Elizabeth. "He was complicated," she said carefully. "He could be difficult, demanding, but he provided for us. He built something significant." "He hurt people," the boy said matter-of-factly. "He thought being powerful meant making others feel small." Elizabeth didn't know how to respond to this strange child who spoke with such certainty about a man he couldn't possibly know. "I should call security," she said, reaching again for the button. "You can," the boy agreed, "but then he'll never wake up." Elizabeth's hand froze. Logic told her this was absurd. A child who had somehow wandered into her husband's room, making impossible claims. Yet something in the boy's steady gaze made her hesitate. "What's your name?" she asked. "Some people call me Sam," the boy replied, though something in his tone suggested this wasn't his real name. "And how exactly do you think you can help my husband, Sam? The best neurologists in the world have tried for 5 years." Sam moved closer to Richard's head, studying the pale, unconscious face with interest. "They tried to fix his brain. That's not the only part of him that needs fixing." Before Elizabeth could respond, the door opened and Timothy entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He stopped abruptly at the sight of the small boy standing by his father's bed. "Mom, who's this?" he asked, setting the coffees down on a side table. "He says his name is Sam," Elizabeth explained, her voice uncertain. "I'm not sure how he got, in here." Timothy approached the boy carefully. "Hey there, are you lost? This is a private room." Sam looked up at Timothy, studying him with the same intense gaze he'd directed at Richard. "You've grown a lot since your piano recital," he said. Timothy's eyes widened. "What did you say?" "The night of the accident," Sam continued, "you played Chopin. You kept looking for him in the audience, but he was closing a deal instead." Timothy took a step back, his face paling. "How could you possibly know that?" Sam turned back to Richard. "I know a lot of things. I know he has one last chance, but only if you let me help him." Elizabeth and Timothy exchanged bewildered looks. "What do you mean, one last chance?" Elizabeth asked. "To fix what he broke," Sam replied, "inside and outside." He placed his small hand on Richard's forehead. "It won't be easy for him. Some damage can't be undone, but he can still make things right." "This is crazy," Timothy muttered. "I'm calling security." "Wait," Elizabeth said suddenly, placing a hand on her son's arm. "Just wait." Something was happening. The monitors connected to Richard had begun to change, his heart rate increasing slightly, the EEG showing spikes of activity where there had been only minimal patterns for years. "What are you doing to him?" Elizabeth asked, torn between fear and fascination. Sam didn't answer. His eyes were closed now, his small hand still resting on Richard's forehead. A strange quality had come over the room. The air felt charged, as if before a lightning strike. The fluorescent lights above them flickered once, twice, then stabilized at a brightness that seemed more intense than before. "Mom," Timothy whispered, "look at Dad's hand." Elizabeth glanced down and gasped. Richard's fingers, motionless for 5 years except during passive physical therapy, were twitching slightly against the white hospital sheet. "That's impossible," she breathed. "You should call the doctor," Sam said, his voice strained as if he were exerting great effort. "He's coming back now." Timothy backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving the impossible scene before him. "I'll get Dr. Reynolds." As Timothy rushed from the room, Elizabeth moved closer to Richard's bed, her heart pounding. The monitors continued to show increasing signs of activity, blood pressure rising, oxygen levels improving, brain activity spiking in patterns she'd never seen during the long years of his coma. "What are you?" she asked Sam, no longer trying to make sense of what was happening. The boy opened his eyes, and for a moment, just a brief instant, Elizabeth thought they glowed with an inner light. "Someone who believes in second chances," he said quietly. The door burst open as Dr. Reynolds rushed in, followed by Timothy and 2 nurses. She stopped abruptly at the sight of Sam, then quickly moved to check Richard's vitals. "What's happening? Here? Who is this child?" she demanded, her professional calm giving way to confusion as she saw the readings on the monitors. "He says he can help Dad," Timothy explained, his voice unsteady. "And I think he is." Dr. Reynolds shook her head in disbelief as she examined Richard's pupils with a penlight. "This is medically impossible. His brain activity is increasing exponentially. These patterns suggest—" She broke off as Richard's eyelids fluttered. The room fell into stunned silence, broken only by the accelerating beep of the heart monitor. "It's time," Sam said, stepping back from the bed. "He needs space." The medical team moved in swiftly, checking vitals, adjusting equipment, their professional training taking over despite their astonishment. Elizabeth and Timothy stood back, clutching each other's, hands so tightly their knuckles were white. "Richard?" Dr. Reynolds called, leaning over her patient. "Richard, can you hear me?" For several breathless seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Richard Blackwood's eyes opened for the first time in 5 years. His gaze was unfocused at first, blinking against the bright hospital lights. Dr. Reynolds quickly dimmed them, continuing to speak to him in a calm, clear voice. "Richard, you're in the hospital. You've been unconscious for a long time. Don't try to speak yet, just blink if you can understand me." After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Richard blinked deliberately. A choked sob escaped Elizabeth. Timothy wrapped an arm around his mother's shoulders, his own eyes wide with disbelief. "This is unprecedented," one of the nurses whispered. "Richard, I'm going to ask you to squeeze my hand if you can," Dr. Reynolds continued, placing her hand in his. After a moment of concentration, his fingers closed weakly around hers. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses checking equipment, Dr. Reynolds performing quick neurological assessments, a call going out for the neurology team to assemble immediately. In the commotion, Elizabeth looked around for Sam, but the boy was nowhere to be seen. "Where did he go?" she asked Timothy. "The boy, Sam, where is he?" Timothy glanced around the crowded room. "I don't know. He was just here a minute ago." Elizabeth pushed through the medical personnel to the door, looking out into the corridor. It was empty except for a night nurse at the distant station and an orderly mopping the floor near the elevators. "Did you see a young boy come out of this room?" she asked the orderly. The man looked up, puzzled. "No, ma'am. Nobody's come out of that room except your son when he went to get the doctor." Elizabeth returned to the room, a strange feeling settling over her. "He's gone," she told Timothy, "and no one saw him leave." "Mrs. Blackwood," Dr. Reynolds called, drawing her attention back to the bed. "Your husband is trying to speak to you." Elizabeth rushed to Richard's side. His eyes, those sharp grey eyes she had thought she might never see again, focused on her face with effort. His lips moved, but no sound emerged, his vocal cords weak from years of disuse. "Don't try to talk yet," Dr. Reynolds advised. "Your body needs time to remember how." Richard's face contorted with frustration. His hand moved weakly, fingers making a writing motion. "He wants to write something," Timothy said, grabbing a notepad and pen from the bedside table. Richard's hand trembled as he gripped the pen, his coordination severely compromised. With painstaking effort, he scrawled a single word on the pad, the letters shaky but legible. Boy? Elizabeth and Timothy exchanged glances. You saw him? Elizabeth asked. The boy who was here? Richard managed a faint nod, his eyes intense despite his physical weakness. We don't know who he was, Timothy explained. He just appeared, said he could help you, and then this happened. Richard's fingers tightened around the pen again, struggling to form more words on the page. The effort clearly exhausted him, but he persisted until he had written, "Find him." "Mr. Blackwood, you need to rest," Dr. Reynolds intervened, taking the notepad away. "This is an extraordinary situation, but your brain has been inactive for 5 years. You need to give your body time to recover." Richard's eyes locked with Elizabeth's, conveying a desperation that words couldn't express. She nodded slightly, understanding his unspoken message. "We'll look for him," she promised quietly. The next hours passed in a blur of medical tests, specialist consultations, and stunned disbelief from the hospital staff. News of Richard Blackwood's miraculous awakening spread through the hospital, drawing skeptical doctors from other departments who had to see for themselves. "I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of practice," Dr. Graves admitted, reviewing the latest scan results. "By all medical understanding, this shouldn't be possible. The damage to his brain was too severe for this kind of recovery." "Yet here we are," Dr. Reynolds replied, watching as Richard underwent a basic motor skills assessment, his movements clumsy but improving by the hour. Elizabeth and Timothy remained by Richard's side throughout, witnessing his remarkable progress with a mixture of joy and confusion. By morning he could speak in a hoarse whisper, though complete sentences still eluded him. His questions were simple but insistent. "Boy? Where? Find him." As dawn broke over the New York skyline, Elizabeth stepped into the hallway to call Caroline, with the news of Richard's awakening. When she returned to the room, she found Timothy sitting alone beside his father's bed. "Where are the doctors?" she asked. "Dad convinced them to." "Give him a few minutes of peace," Timothy explained. "They'll be back soon with more tests." Elizabeth sat on the edge of Richard's bed, taking his hand in hers. His skin was warmer now, a hint of color returning to his face. "Richard," she said, gently, "you need to focus on getting better. We can worry about finding the boy later." Richard shook his head stubbornly, his voice a raspy whisper. "Important. Find him." "Why?" Timothy asked. "What do you know about him?" Richard's face contorted with frustration at his inability to express himself fully. With painful slowness, he formed his words carefully. "He saved me. Not finished." "Not finished?" Elizabeth repeated. "What does that mean?" Before Richard could attempt to answer, the door opened and Caroline Hamilton entered, her face a mask of shock and hope. She stopped at the foot of the bed, staring at her former boss as if she were seeing a ghost. "It's true," she whispered. "When Elizabeth called, I could hardly believe it." Richard's eyes fixed on Caroline with recognition. "Caroline," he managed, his voice slightly stronger than before. "Yes," she said, moving closer. "I'm still here, Mr. Blackwood." Something passed across Richard's face, a shadow of his old self, the commanding presence that had once dominated boardrooms and broken competitors. "Company?" he asked. Caroline hesitated, glancing at Elizabeth. "Perhaps we should discuss business matters when you're stronger." "Now," Richard insisted, his fingers tightening around Elizabeth's hand. Caroline sighed, then straightened her shoulders. "Blackwood Enterprises is different now. Victor Harrington has been acting CEO. During your absence, the board officially appointed him as your permanent replacement last month." Richard's heart monitor showed a spike in his pulse. "Victor," he repeated, a darkness crossing his face. "He's transformed the company," Caroline continued carefully. "It's more profitable than ever, but, Elizabeth prompted. "But the methods are extreme, even by Mr. Blackwood's former standards," Caroline finished diplomatically. "The corporate culture has become ruthless." Richard closed his eyes, a mixture of emotions crossing his face: anger, regret, determination. When he opened them again, there was a clarity that hadn't been there before. "Phone," he demanded, his voice stronger than it had been since waking. "Richard, you're in no condition," Elizabeth began. "Phone," he repeated firmly. "Need to." "Carlet's board, my company." Dr. Reynolds entered the room, frowning at the elevated readings on Richard's monitors. "That's enough excitement for now," she said authoritatively. "Mr. Blackwood needs rest. His recovery is still in the earlier stages." Richard fixed the doctor with the commanding stare that had once made executives tremble. "Need to find... boy, Sam." Dr. Reynolds looked confused. "What boy?" "The child who was here last night," Elizabeth explained, "just before Richard woke up." The doctor's frown deepened. "Mrs. Blackwood, there was no child in this room last night. Hospital security is quite strict, especially in the ICU. No unauthorized visitors, particularly not children." "But we all saw him," Timothy insisted. "He was right here. He put his hand on Dad's forehead and then everything changed." Dr. Reynolds exchanged a concerned glance with her colleagues. "I understand this is an emotional time, but there was no child recorded entering this floor last night. Perhaps in the excitement and stress of the situation, not imaginary," Richard rasped, his frustration evident. "Real. Find him." As the medical team insisted on continuing their examinations, Elizabeth pulled Timothy aside. "We need to find that boy," she whispered. "Your father is fixated on him, and I don't think he'll rest until we do." Timothy nodded. "I'll check the hospital security footage. Someone must have seen him. And I'll talk to every nurse and orderly on this floor," Elizabeth added. "He couldn't have just vanished." As they formulated their plan, neither noticed Richard watching them intently, his eyes clearer and more focused than they had any right to be after 5 years of unconsciousness. Nor did they see the shadow that passed briefly across the window outside his room, a small figure visible for just a moment against the morning light before disappearing from view. 3 weeks after his miraculous awakening, Richard Blackwood sat in a wheelchair on the private terrace of his Park Avenue penthouse, a cashmere blanket across his legs, despite the warm spring air. The Manhattan skyline spread before him, a testament to the power and wealth he had accumulated over decades of ruthless business dealings. Dr. Reynolds had called his recovery unprecedented and medically inexplicable. Physical therapy that should have taken months had been compressed into weeks. His speech had returned almost completely, though occasionally he still struggled to find words. His cognitive functions were remarkably intact, defying all neurological expectations for someone emerging from a 5-year coma. Yet, for all his progress, Richard remained obsessed with one thing: finding the boy called Sam who had awakened him from his coma. "Any news?" he asked as Elizabeth joined him on the terrace, carrying a tray with his medications and a glass of water. She shook her head, setting the tray on the table beside him. "The private investigators are still looking, but they haven't found anything new. The hospital security footage from that night shows static during the exact minutes he was in your room. None of the staff remember seeing a child matching his description." Richard's jaw tightened. "He was real, Elizabeth. I saw him. You saw him. Timothy saw him." "I know," she said gently, taking his hand. "I believe you, but it's as if he vanished into thin air." The penthouse intercom buzzed, and Elizabeth went to answer it. She returned moments later with Timothy and Caroline. Timothy had postponed his freshman year at Princeton to help with his father's recovery and the search for the mysterious boy. At 17, he had matured rapidly in the weeks since his father's awakening, handling the investigators and hospital inquiries with surprising competence. "We've checked every homeless shelter and youth program within 50 miles, Timothy reported, pulling up a chair beside his father. "No one recognizes a boy matching Sam's description." Caroline placed a leather portfolio on the table. "The board meeting is scheduled for next week, Mr. Blackwood. They've agreed to hear your case for reinstating you as CEO, but Victor has been rallying support against you." Richard's eyes hardened at the mention of Victor Harrington. During his absence, Victor had transformed Blackwood Enterprises into an even more ruthless corporation than Richard had built, employing tactics that crossed ethical and sometimes legal boundaries. "What's he been saying?" Richard asked, his voice steady but tight with controlled anger. That your recovery, while remarkable, doesn't mean you're fit to lead the company again, Caroline replied carefully. He's suggesting a medical evaluation before any decisions are made. He's afraid, Richard said, a ghost of his old predatory smile crossing his face. As he should be. Elizabeth frowned. Richard, are you sure this is what you should be focusing on right now? Your recovery is proceeding exactly as it should, he interrupted. Finding Sam and reclaiming my company are my priorities now. Timothy exchanged a concerned glance with his mother. Since awakening, Richard had shown glimpses of his old ruthless nature, particularly when discussing Victor Harrington, but there were also moments of surprising tenderness and reflection that had never been part of his character before. Dad, Timothy said carefully, why is finding this boy so important to you? What do you think he can tell you? Richard was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he gazed out at the city. He didn't just wake me up, Timothy. He showed me something, gave me a message. I can't explain it fully, but I need to understand what happened. What message? Elizabeth asked. Before Richard could answer, the elevator to their penthouse chimed, announcing another arrival. The private nurse appeared on the terrace. Mr. Blackwood, Detective Morris is here to see you about the investigation. Richard straightened in his wheelchair. Send him in. Detective James Morris was a veteran of the NYPD who had taken early retirement to open a private investigation firm. Richard had hired him specifically to lead the search for Sam, offering an exorbitant fee for his exclusive attention to the case. Mr. Blackwood, Morris greeted, stepping onto the terrace. The detective was a solidly built man in his 50s, with shrewd eyes and the careful manner of someone who had seen too much to be easily surprised. Mrs. Blackwood, Timothy. What have you found? Richard demanded, dispensing with pleasantries. Morris pulled out a tablet. We've been analyzing traffic camera footage from the streets surrounding the hospital on the night of your awakening. Most showed nothing unusual, but a camera 2 blocks away captured this. He turned the tablet to show them a grainy image of a small figure in a grey hoodie walking away from the hospital. The child's face wasn't visible, but the build and clothing matched their description of Sam. Can you track where he went? Elizabeth asked eagerly. Morris shook his head. That's the strange part. He appears on this camera, walks exactly 2 blocks, and then simply vanishes. We've checked every camera in a 10-block radius. He doesn't appear on any of them. What about facial recognition? Richard asked. We don't have a clear image of his face, Morris explained, and even if we did, he's not in any database we can access. No missing child reports match his description. No school records we can find. It's as if this boy doesn't exist. Richard's expression darkened. Everyone exists, Detective. You just haven't looked hard enough. Morris didn't flinch under Richard's intense gaze. Mr. Blackwood, I've been doing this work for 30 years. I've never encountered a case quite like this. There's something unusual about this situation. What do you mean? Timothy asked. Morris hesitated. In my experience, when someone is this difficult to find, it's because they don't want to be found. But this is different. It's not just that we can't find him, it's almost as if he was never really there to begin with. He was there, Richard insisted, his voice hard, and I will find him with or without your help. I'm not abandoning the case, Morris assured him. I'm just suggesting we consider other angles. For instance, you mentioned he knew details about your family that he couldn't possibly know. That suggests some connection to you personally. Have you considered that he might be connected to someone from your past? Richard fell silent, a strange expression crossing his face. Elizabeth recognized it, the same look he'd had several times since waking, usually when he thought no one was watching. A mixture of recognition and what almost looked like fear. There is someone, Richard said finally, his voice barely audible. From a long time ago. Who? Elizabeth asked, surprised. In all their years of marriage, Richard had rarely spoken about his childhood or early life. Richard shook his head. I need to look into something first. A possibility. Morris nodded. I'll continue following the leads we have. But if you think of anything that might help, any connection, any reason this boy might have sought you out specifically, let me know immediately." After the detective left, Richard turned to Caroline. "I need access to my old files, the personal ones from before Blackwood Enterprises. They should be in storage at the Hampton house." Caroline looked surprised. Richard had never been one to dwell on the past. "I'll arrange to have them brought here tomorrow." "No," Richard said firmly. "I want to go there myself, tomorrow." "Richard, you're not strong enough yet for a trip to the Hamptons," Elizabeth protested. "Dr. Reynolds said—" "I don't care what Reynolds said," Richard cut her off. "This is important. I need to see those files myself." Timothy studied his father carefully. "What are you looking for, Dad?" Richard's eyes met his son's, and for a moment his carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing something vulnerable underneath. "Answers," he said simply, "about who I was, who I became, and who Sam might be." Later that evening, after Caroline had gone and Timothy had retired to his room, Elizabeth found Richard in his study, staring at an old photograph she had never seen before. It showed two young boys by a lake, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning widely at the camera. "Who is that?" she asked, sitting beside him on the leather sofa. Richard's finger traced the image of the dark-haired boy beside his younger self. "Michael Sullivan," he said quietly. "My best friend when I was a kid. We spent every summer together at my grandparents' lake house in Vermont." Elizabeth was surprised. In 20 years of marriage, Richard had never mentioned this friend. "You never told me about him." "No," Richard agreed, his voice distant. "I never told anyone about Michael." Something in his tone made Elizabeth uneasy. "What happened to him? Did you lose touch?" Richard carefully returned the photograph to his desk drawer. "Something like that." Before Elizabeth could press further, Richard's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened. "Victor," he said, answering the call and putting it on speaker. "Richard," Victor Harrington's smooth voice filled the room. "I heard you're planning to attend the board meeting next week. How ambitious of you, given your condition." "My condition is improving daily," Richard replied coldly. "I'll be resuming my position as CEO by the end of the month." Victor laughed, the sound devoid of warmth. "I admire your confidence, Richard, but things have changed. The company has evolved beyond your outdated approach." "You mean you've stripped it of whatever ethics I managed to maintain?" Richard countered. "Ethics?" Victor sounded genuinely amused. "That's rich coming from you, Richard. You taught me everything I know about crushing the competition and maximizing profit at any cost. I've simply perfected your methods." Elizabeth watched as Richard's hand tightened around the phone. "We'll see what the board has to say about your perfected methods when I present evidence of your offshore accounts and the bribes you've been paying to secure contracts in Southeast Asia." A moment of silence followed. "You're bluffing," Victor finally said, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. "You've been in a coma for 5 years. You don't have access to that information." "I have friends in unexpected places," Richard replied. "Caroline has been quite helpful in keeping certain records for me." "Caroline is nothing but a secretary with delusions of loyalty," Victor snapped. "And you're nothing but a broken old man trying to reclaim past glories. Stay home, Richard. Enjoy your retirement. Don't make me destroy what little reputation you have left." The call ended abruptly. Richard set the phone down, his expression unreadable. "Is it true?" Elizabeth asked after a moment. "About the evidence against Victor?" Richard nodded. "Caroline has been documenting his activities since he took over. She never trusted him." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to worry you," Richard said, "and I needed to be sure of my next move." Elizabeth studied her husband carefully. The Richard I knew before the accident would have been plotting Victor's complete destruction by now, calling in every favor, leveraging every weakness. "You seem different." Richard met her gaze, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Uncertainty and perhaps a flicker of genuine remorse. "Maybe I am different," he said quietly. Or maybe I'm finally remembering who I was supposed to be. The next morning, against Dr. Reynolds's explicit medical advice, Richard insisted on traveling to their Hampton estate. The journey exhausted him, but he refused to rest upon arrival, immediately demanding access to the storage room where his oldest files were kept. Timothy helped him navigate the wheelchair through the sprawling beach house to a room Elizabeth had never entered, Richard's private archive from before they were married. "I'll take it from here," Richard told them firmly. "Alone." Elizabeth started to protest, but Timothy placed a hand on her arm. "Let him do this, Mom," he said quietly. "I think he needs to." Reluctantly, she agreed, and they left Richard alone in the room filled with boxes of his past. Hours passed. Elizabeth checked on him once, only to be brusquely dismissed. Finally, as evening approached, Richard emerged, looking exhausted, but strangely calm, a dusty file box on his lap. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Elizabeth asked as he wheeled himself into the living room. Richard nodded slowly. "I think so. I need to make a call." He picked up his phone and dialed Detective Morris. "I know where to look for Sam," he said when the detective answered. "Lake Champlain, Vermont, a town called Whiteshore. There's a property there that belonged to my grandparents, the Blackwood Lake House." After ending the call, Richard turned to find Elizabeth and Timothy watching him with concern. "Dad, what's going on?" Timothy asked. "What's at this lake house?" Richard opened the file box on his lap, removing a yellowed newspaper clipping. He handed it to his son without a word. Timothy read the headline aloud. "Local boy hospitalized after lake accident." Below was a photograph of a young Richard, perhaps 9 years old, wrapped in a blanket, looking shell-shocked. Richard Blackwood, age 9, was rescued from Lake Champlain after a boating accident Wednesday afternoon. Timothy continued reading. His companion, Michael Sullivan, also 9, pulled Blackwood from the water before... Timothy's voice faltered as he reached the end of the paragraph. "Before what?" Elizabeth asked, taking the clipping from her son's trembling hands. She read the final words silently. "Before losing consciousness himself, Sullivan remains in critical condition at Whiteshore General Hospital." She looked up at her husband, suddenly understanding. "Michael Sullivan was the friend in the photograph. He saved you from drowning." Richard nodded, his face pale with the strain of surfacing long-buried memories. "I never told anyone the full story of what happened that day. Michael and I were out in my grandfather's boat. I was showing off, standing up, rocking the boat. He warned me to be careful. I didn't listen." His voice grew distant, as if he were seeing not the Hampton house but the lake from decades ago. "The boat capsized. I couldn't swim well. I panicked, started going under. Michael was a strong swimmer. He could have easily made it to shore. Instead, he came back for me, pulled me up, kept me afloat until I could grab onto the overturned boat. But the current was strong that day. Keeping me above water exhausted him. By the time the rescue boat reached us, Michael had gone under. They resuscitated him, but he never..." Richard's voice broke. "He never regained consciousness. 3 days later, he was gone." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of waves breaking on the beach outside. "Sam is Michael," Timothy said slowly, understanding dawning on his face. "Somehow the boy who saved you at the hospital is Michael Sullivan." "That's not possible," Elizabeth whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. After witnessing Richard's miraculous awakening, she found it harder to dismiss the impossible. "Isn't it?" Richard asked quietly. "Sam knew things only Michael could know. He had the same eyes, the same determined expression. And he saved me, just like before." He pulled another document from the box, a faded color photograph of Michael Sullivan, school portrait style. The resemblance to the boy who had appeared in Richard's hospital room was undeniable. "But why now?" Elizabeth asked. "After all these years?" Richard's expression darkened. "Because I forgot him. Buried what happened. Became someone who dishonored his sacrifice." He looked up at his wife and son, his eyes filled with a clarity and purpose that had been absent for years, even before the accident. "Michael gave his life to save mine, and I wasted that gift becoming a man he would have despised." Now he's giving me a second chance, and this time I won't waste it. The small town of Whiteshore, Vermont, hadn't changed much in the 43 years since Richard had last seen it. The same Victorian houses lined the main street, their gingerbread trim freshly painted but otherwise unchanged. The same ancient elm trees provided dappled shade. Even the general store at the town center looked frozen in time, its hand-painted sign gently weathered, but still proclaiming Whiteshore General Mercantile, Estern, 1897. Richard sat in the passenger seat of the SUV as Timothy drove slowly down Lake Road, the familiar route to his grandparents' old property, bringing back a flood of memories. Elizabeth had stayed behind in New York, reluctantly agreeing that this journey was something Richard and Timothy needed to make together. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" Timothy asked, glancing at his father. In the month since his awakening, Richard had made remarkable physical progress, now able to walk short distances with a cane, though he tired easily. "I'm sure," Richard replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The investigators found nothing in New York. If Sam Michael is going to appear again, it will be here. This is where it all began. Detective Morris had been skeptical about Richard's theory, but had dispatched a local investigator to check the property the day before. The report indicated that the Blackwood Lake house, which had been sold after Richard's grandparents passed away, was currently unoccupied, its owners only visiting during summer months. Timothy turned onto a narrow, gravel drive that wound through thick pine forest. According to GPS, we're almost there. As the trees thinned, the lake came into view, a vast expanse of blue water stretching to distant mountains. And there, perched on a gentle slope overlooking the shore, stood the Blackwood Lake house. Richard's breath caught at the sight. The new owners had maintained the property well, the cedar shingles aged to a silver gray, the wide porch still wrapping around three sides of the house. Only the color had changed, the dark green trim of his childhood now replaced with a cheerful blue. "It's smaller than I remembered," Richard murmured as Timothy parked in the gravel driveway. "Most things are when we revisit them as adults," Timothy replied, turning off the engine. Richard opened his door slowly, breathing in the pine-scented air. With careful movements, he eased himself out of the vehicle, leaning heavily on his cane. Timothy hurried around to support him, but Richard waved him off. "I need to do this myself," he said firmly. Together they approached the house, climbing the 3 steps to the porch with Richard pausing to catch his breath at the top. The property was peaceful in the late afternoon light, the only sounds being the gentle lapping of waves against the shore and the distant call of a loon. "So this is where it happened?" Timothy asked, looking out toward the lake. "Where Michael saved you?" Richard shook his head. "Not here by the house. There's a cove about a quarter-mile down the shoreline. That's where we capsized." He turned away from the house, moving toward a path that led along the waterfront. Timothy followed closely, ready to offer support if needed. "We came here every summer," Richard said as they walked slowly. "My family and the Sullivans. Our fathers were college roommates. Michael and I were born 2 weeks apart. We joked we were almost twins." The path curved through stands of birch trees, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Richard's steps grew slower, more labored, but he pressed on with grim determination. "Michael was everything I wasn't," he continued. "Kind, thoughtful, always thinking of others. I was the opposite, impatient, self-centered, always showing off." "Sounds like you were just being kids," Timothy offered. Richard shook his head. "It was more than that. Even then there was something harsh in me. My father was a demanding man, never satisfied with anything less than perfection. I think I was trying to be like him, to earn his approval." They reached a clearing where the path widened, offering a view of a small, sheltered cove. Richard stopped, leaning heavily on his cane, his eyes fixed on the water. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is where it happened." Timothy stood silently beside his father, sensing the weight of memory bearing down on him. The cove was peaceful, sunlight dancing on the gentle waves. It was difficult to imagine it as the site of such tragedy. "We weren't supposed to take the boat out alone," Richard continued after a moment. "But I convinced Michael it would be fine. I always could talk him into things he knew were wrong. He was a better kid than me, but he was loyal to a fault. Richard's voice grew strained. When I fell in, I panicked, started thrashing around, pushing myself deeper. Michael dove in after me. He was a strong swimmer, but I was in such a panic that I grabbed onto him, nearly pulling us both under. Somehow he calmed me down, got me to hold onto the boat. He fell silent, lost in the memory. Timothy waited, giving his father space to process emotions that had clearly been buried for decades. By the time help arrived, Michael had gone under, Richard finally continued. They pulled him out, got his heart started again, but he never woke up. 3 days later, his parents made the decision to remove life support. Timothy placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You were just children, Dad. It wasn't your fault." Richard's jaw tightened. "It was my fault, my recklessness, my showing off, my panic in the water. Everything that happened that day was because of me." A rustling in the trees behind them made both men turn. For a moment, the forest was still. Then a squirrel darted across the path. Richard's shoulders slumped with disappointment. "Let's head back to the house," Timothy suggested gently. "You need to rest." Richard nodded reluctantly. The walk back was slower, his energy clearly fading. By the time they reached the porch, he was leaning heavily on Timothy's arm. "We should find a hotel in town," Timothy said, as he helped his father onto a porch swing. "It'll be dark soon." "No," Richard said firmly. "We're staying here." Timothy frowned. "Dad, this isn't our property anymore. We can't just—" "Call Detective Morris," Richard interrupted. "Have him contact the owners. Offer whatever it takes for one night's use of the house." Timothy wanted to argue, but recognized the determination in his father's eyes. He stepped away to make the call, leaving Richard alone on the porch, staring out at the lake as the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. To Timothy's surprise, Morris was able to reach the current owners, who agreed to let them stay the night once they understood the unusual circumstances. A neighbor brought over a key and some basic supplies, eyeing Richard curiously but asking no questions. Inside, the house had been extensively renovated, though the basic layout remained the same. Richard moved slowly through the rooms, touching door frames and window sills lost in memories. "My room was up there," he said, pointing to the second floor. "Michael always stayed in the guest room next to mine. We'd sneak out onto the roof, through the dormer windows at night, looking at the stars, making plans for the future." His voice faltered. Plans he never got to fulfill. They ate a simple dinner of sandwiches from supplies the neighbor had brought. As night fell, Richard grew increasingly restless, checking windows, moving from room to room. "Dad, you need to rest," Timothy insisted as the clock approached midnight. "You've pushed yourself too hard today." "He'll come," Richard said with absolute certainty. "If not outside, then in my dreams. He has to." Timothy helped his father upstairs to what had once been the master bedroom. The four-poster bed and heavy oak furniture of Richard's grandparents had been replaced with more modern pieces, but the view of the lake from the large windows remained the same. Richard insisted on sitting in an armchair by the window rather than lying down. "I'll sleep here," he said. "I need to be able to see the lake." Too exhausted to argue, Timothy made sure his father was comfortable before retiring to a nearby bedroom, leaving the connecting door ajar so he could hear if Richard needed anything during the night. Despite his fatigue, Timothy found sleep elusive. The strange circumstances of their journey, his father's obsession with finding the mysterious boy, and the emotional weight of the stories he'd heard that day kept his mind racing. It was well past 2 in the morning when he finally drifted off. Sound woke him, a voice not his father's coming from the next room. Timothy sat up, instantly alert. Pale moonlight filtered through the curtains, providing just enough light to see by. He moved silently to the connecting door and peered through. Richard was still in the armchair by the window, but he was no longer alone. A small figure stood before him, a boy in a grey hoodie, his back to Timothy. "You found me," the boy said, his voice young but carrying an odd maturity. "I knew you would." "Michael," Richard's voice broke on the name. "It is you, isn't it?" The boy nodded. In a way. I've been waiting for you to remember, Richard. It took you long enough. Timothy remained frozen in the doorway, afraid that any movement might cause the boy to vanish. His father leaned forward in his chair, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry," Richard whispered. "For everything. For that day on the lake. For wasting the life you saved. For becoming someone you would have hated." "I never hated you, Richard," the boy said gently. "I was disappointed. You had so much potential to do good in the world. Instead, you chose power and control." "Why now?" Richard asked. "Why come back after all these years?" The boy, Michael or Sam or whatever he truly was, moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit lake. "Because you were running out of time, and I couldn't bear to see your life end without redemption." "What do you mean, running out of time?" Timothy found himself speaking, unable to remain silent any longer. The boy turned, seeming unsurprised by Timothy's presence. In the moonlight, his features were clearer than they had been in the hospital, a serious face with intense blue eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond his apparent years. "Your father's brain sustained severe damage during his coma. The boy explained, turning back to Richard. "I was able to wake him to restore much of his function, but I couldn't repair everything. The doctors haven't detected it yet in their tests, but the damage will progress." Richard nodded slowly. "I've suspected as much. The headaches, the moments of confusion, the temporary loss of feeling in my left side. How long do I have?" "A year of clarity, perhaps a little more," the boy replied. "After that, the deterioration will accelerate." Timothy stepped fully into the room. "No, that's not possible. The doctors said he's recovering exceptionally well." "They can only see what their instruments show them," the boy said. "There are some things science can't yet measure." Richard held up a hand to quiet his son's protests. "It's all right, Timothy. I've known something was wrong. A year is more than I deserve." "Don't say that, Dad," Timothy pleaded. "It's true," Richard insisted. "After everything I've done, the people I've hurt, the way I've lived my life, I'm lucky to have any time at all." The boy moved closer to Richard. "That's why I'm here. Not just to wake you, but to offer you a chance to make things right before it's too late. To save not just your body, but your soul." "How?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible. "How can I possibly make up for decades of cruelty and selfishness in 1 year?" "By remembering who you were before ambition corrupted you," the boy said. "By making amends to those you've wronged. By using your remaining time to create a legacy of compassion rather than fear." He placed a small hand on Richard's arm. "It won't be easy. Those you've hurt won't trust your transformation. Some will actively work against you. You'll face resistance from those who profited from your old ways, especially Victor." "Victor?" Richard's expression darkened. "He's taken everything I built and made it worse." "And who taught him how to be ruthless?" the boy asked gently. "Who showed him that profit matters more than people?" Richard's shoulders slumped with the weight of recognition. "I did." "Your first test will be at the board meeting," the boy continued. "How you handle Victor will reveal whether you're truly committed to change." "What should I do?" Richard asked. The boy shook his head. "I can't tell you that. You have to find your own path to redemption. But I'll be watching, and I'll return when you need me most." He stepped back, and Timothy noticed with a jolt that the boy's feet didn't seem to quite touch the floor. A faint, golden glow appeared around his silhouette. "Wait," Richard called desperately. "There's so much more I need to ask you. So much." "I don't understand." The boy smiled, a gentle expression that transformed his serious face. "Understanding isn't always necessary for forgiveness, Richard. Sometimes acceptance is enough." Timothy blinked, and in that instant the boy vanished. One moment he was standing by the window, bathed in moonlight, and the next he was gone, leaving no trace of his presence. Richard slumped in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 52 years and more. "Did you see him, Timothy? Did you hear him? Tell me I'm not losing my mind." Timothy moved to his father's side, kneeling beside the chair. "I saw him, Dad. I heard everything." Richard took his son's hand, gripping it with surprising strength. "Then you know what I have to do. 1 year to make things right. To become..." The man Michael always believed I could be. We'll do it together, Timothy promised, whatever it takes. Richard nodded, his eyes drifting back to the window and the lake beyond. It starts with Victor and the board meeting. I've been planning to destroy him, to expose his corruption and reclaim my company through force. That's the old Richard speaking. What will the new Richard do? Timothy asked. A look of determination settled over Richard's features. Something much harder than revenge. Something that requires more courage than ruthlessness ever did. What's that? Richard turned to his son, his eyes clear and focused despite the late hour and emotional exhaustion. Forgiveness, compassion, the very things I've spent a lifetime dismissing as weakness. He struggled to his feet, leaning on his cane but standing straight. Come on, we need to get back to New York tomorrow. There's so much to do and so little time. As they left the room, neither man noticed the small footprints that appeared briefly in the dust on the windowsill before fading away like morning mist under the rising sun. The boardroom of Blackwood Enterprises occupied the entire top floor of Blackwood Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Manhattan. Once, Richard had found power in these views, a tangible reminder of his dominance over the city's business world. Now, as he stood at the head of the massive conference table, waiting for the board members to arrive, he felt something entirely different, a profound sense of responsibility and surprisingly regret. "Are you sure about this approach?" Caroline asked quietly, arranging presentation materials at each seat. "It's not too late to use the evidence against Victor." Richard shook his head. "No. Destroying Victor won't undo the damage I've done. It would only perpetuate the cycle." Caroline studied him with poorly concealed concern. Since his return from Vermont 3 days ago, Richard had been different, more reflective, less combative. She had attributed the change to exhaustion, but now she wasn't so sure. "He won't show you the same mercy," she warned. "Victor will do everything in his power to keep you from reclaiming your position." "I'm counting on it," Richard replied, cryptically. The boardroom doors opened, and Elizabeth and Timothy entered. Elizabeth crossed to her husband, straightening his tie in a gesture of affection and support. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly, noticing the slight tremor in his hands that had begun appearing intermittently since their return from Vermont. "I'm fine," Richard assured her, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. The headaches were getting worse, and there had been moments of confusion that he tried to hide, but that his family had begun to notice. Timothy approached, nodding toward the elevators where the indicator lights showed multiple cars ascending to their floor. "They're on their way up. Are you ready for this?" Richard took a deep breath, centering himself. "As ready as I'll ever be." The board members began arriving in groups of 2 and 3, 12 men and women representing some of the most powerful financial interests in the country. Many had served on the board since Richard founded the company, growing wealthy from his aggressive business strategies. Their reactions to seeing him standing at the head of the table ranged from shock to cautious pleasure to barely concealed dismay. The last to arrive was Victor Harrington. At 45, Victor was at the height of his power, tall, impeccably dressed, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. He stopped short at the sight of Richard, then quickly composed himself into a mask of professional courtesy. "Richard," he greeted with a cold smile, "how good to see you up and about. We weren't expecting you to personally attend today." "Victor," Richard acknowledged with a nod, "I wouldn't miss it." The tension between the two men was palpable as Victor took his seat at the opposite end of the table, the CEO's seat that had been Richard's for decades. The other board members settled into their places, watching the dynamic between founder and current CEO with barely concealed fascination. "Shall we begin?" Victor suggested smoothly, tapping his tablet to bring the room's presentation screens to life. "We have a full agenda today, and I'm sure we all want to accommodate Richard's health constraints." Richard remained standing, commanding the room's attention through presence, rather than words. "Actually, Victor, I'd like to address the board first, if you don't mind." Victor's smile tightened. "Of course, the floor is yours." Richard surveyed the faces around the table, People he had worked with for years. Some he had mentored, others he had threatened or manipulated to get his way. He saw wariness in their eyes, expectation of the ruthless Richard Blackwood they had always known. For 25 years, he began, his voice stronger than it had been since awakening, I built this company with a single-minded focus on growth and profitability. I taught everyone in this room that success was measured in stock prices and market share, that compassion was weakness, and that people were resources to be used and discarded. He paused, letting his words sink in. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly not expecting this opening. I was wrong, Richard continued simply. A ripple of surprised murmurs circulated around the table. Victor leaned forward, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. 5 years in a coma gives a man time to reassess his priorities, Richard said, or perhaps it took a miracle to wake me up in more ways than one. He moved slowly, around the table, making eye contact with each board member. Blackwood Enterprises has become something I no longer recognize, a company that values profit above all else, that exploits workers, that views ethical corners as things to be cut, rather than standards to be upheld. Richard, Victor interrupted, perhaps this discussion would be better held in private. Your emotional state after your long recovery. My emotional state is perfectly clear, Victor, Richard cut him off firmly, clearer than it's been in decades. He turned to address the board directly. I'm not here to reclaim my position as CEO, not today. I'm here to propose a new direction for the company that bears my name. With a nod to Caroline, the presentation screens changed to display a comprehensive new corporate structure and ethical framework. Richard outlined his vision: fair labor practices, environmental responsibility, community investment, and a corporate culture built on respect rather than fear. These changes will temporarily reduce our profit margins, he acknowledged, addressing the immediate concern visible on several faces. But they will create sustainable growth and restore this company's reputation. More importantly, they will allow us all to be proud of what we've built. Victor's laugh cut through the room, sharp, dismissive. This is absurd. Richard's medical ordeal has clearly affected his judgment. This bleeding heart approach would destroy everything we've built. Everything I built, Victor, Richard corrected quietly. And yes, it would dismantle the culture of fear and exploitation that I created and that you've perfected. He turned back to the board. I'm not asking for your decision today. I'm asking you to consider what kind of company you want to be associated with in the years to come. One that profits from harm, or one that succeeds while doing good. Martha Chen, one of the longest-serving board members, leaned forward. Richard, while these are admirable sentiments, the practical reality is that implementing such sweeping changes would destabilize the company. Our shareholders would benefit in the long term, Richard finished for her. I've included 5-year projections that show we would return to current profitability levels within 3 years, with more sustainable growth patterns thereafter. He returned to the head of the table, facing Victor directly across its length. I'm prepared to put my own fortune behind this transition. 30% of my personal wealth will be dedicated to cushioning the financial impact of these changes. The room fell silent as the board members processed this unprecedented offer. Richard Blackwood, known for his relentless pursuit of wealth, was volunteering to sacrifice a significant portion of his personal fortune. Victor recovered first, his expression hardening. This is nothing but a power play. Richard wants to oust me and regain control. These so-called ethical reforms are just window dressing. If I wanted to oust you, Victor, I would have done it differently, Richard replied calmly. I have evidence of your offshore accounts, the environmental violations you've concealed, and the labor laws you've systematically broken in our overseas operations. Victor paled slightly but maintained his composure. Baseless accusations. Richard shook his head, then did something that shocked everyone in the room. He smiled at Victor with what appeared to be genuine compassion. They're not baseless, and we both know it, but I'm not going to use that information against you. He opened the folder in front of him and slid the contents across the table. "Instead, I'm giving you these documents. Everything. Caroline and I have collected. Consider it a gesture of good faith." Victor stared at the folder, visibly stunned. "I don't understand." "I taught you to be ruthless, Victor," Richard said quietly. "I modeled the behavior that you've taken to its logical conclusion. I can hardly condemn you for becoming exactly what I shaped you to be." The boardroom remained silent, the members watching this unexpected exchange with astonishment. No one had ever seen Richard Blackwood, the notorious corporate shark, extend forgiveness or take responsibility. "What exactly are you proposing, Richard?" asked James Winters, the board chairman. "A gradual transition," Richard replied, returning to his seat. "Victor remains CEO for now, but with a mandate to implement these reforms under the supervision of an ethics committee. I will serve as an advisor without executive power. If the changes prove successful after 1 year, we can discuss more permanent leadership arrangements." Victor's expression shifted from confusion to calculation. "And if I refuse? Then the board will need to decide between your vision and mine," Richard said simply. "I'm not here to force anyone's hand. I'm here to offer a better way forward." For the next 2 hours, the board engaged in heated discussion, questioning Richard's proposals, challenging his projections, and expressing skepticism about his transformation. Throughout, Richard remained calm and focused, answering with a clarity and patience that many had never seen from him before. Victor participated minimally, clearly reassessing his position as he observed the shifting sentiments around the table. Several board members who had initially seemed dismissive of Richard's proposals began showing interest as the discussion progressed. Finally, Chairman Winters called for a preliminary vote, not on implementing the changes, but on exploring them further with a dedicated committee. "Those in favor of establishing a committee to evaluate Mr. Blackwood's proposed reforms?" he asked. One by one, hands rose around the table. 8 of the 12 board members voted in favor, their expressions ranging from cautious optimism to resigned acceptance. "The motion passes," Winters declared. "We'll establish the committee immediately and reconvene in 30 days for a more detailed discussion." As the meeting adjourned, board members approached Richard individually, some expressing support, others voicing concerns, but all engaging with him in a way that acknowledged his unexpected approach. Elizabeth and Timothy waited patiently, pride evident in their expressions. Victor remained seated until the room had nearly emptied, then approached Richard with careful deliberation. "I don't know what game you're playing," he said quietly, "but this new persona won't fool me. The Richard Blackwood I know would never surrender power or advantage." "You're right," Richard agreed. "The Richard Blackwood you knew wouldn't. But near-death experiences have a way of changing perspectives." Victor studied him closely. "This isn't over." "No," Richard acknowledged. "It's just beginning. The question is whether you'll fight me or join me in building something better than what we had before." Without waiting for a response, Richard turned away, signaling the end of their conversation. Victor stood motionless for a moment, then left without another word. As the boardroom emptied, Richard sank into his chair, suddenly exhausted. The tremor in his hands had worsened, and a familiar pressure was building behind his eyes, the precursor to the severe headaches that had been increasing in frequency. "Dad?" Timothy approached, concern evident in his voice. "Are you okay?" Richard nodded, though the effort cost him. "Just tired. It went better than I expected." "You were incredible," Elizabeth said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I've never seen you like that before, so measured, so wise." "Not wise," Richard corrected with a faint smile, "just finally learning from my mistakes." Caroline approached with his medication and a glass of water. "You should go home and rest. You've done enough for today." Richard took the pills gratefully, though he knew they would only dull the pain, not eliminate it. The headache was coming. On stronger now, blurring the edges of his vision. "Victor won't give up easily," Caroline warned as she gathered their materials. "He has too much to lose." "I know," Richard acknowledged, "but perhaps he also has something to gain. A chance at redemption, just as I've been given." As they prepared to leave, Richard paused at the window, looking out at the city sprawled below. From this height, people on the streets were tiny figures, anonymous and distant. For decades, that's how he had viewed humanity, insignificant pieces in his grand game of acquisition and control. Now, as the sun gleamed off distant windows and cast long shadows between the buildings, he saw something different. A community of individuals, each with their own struggles, dreams, and potential for both harm and good. "A year isn't much time," he murmured, more to himself than to those around him. "What did you say, Dad?" Timothy asked, moving to his side. Richard turned to his son, suddenly acutely aware of how little time they might have left together. "Nothing important. Let's go home." As they walked toward the elevator, Richard glanced back at the empty boardroom, one last time. For a brief moment he thought he saw a small figure standing by the window, a boy in a grey hoodie, watching him with those unnaturally wise blue eyes. Then he blinked, and the image was gone. But the message remained clear in his mind, one step taken, many more to go. The path to redemption would not be easy, but for the first time in his life, Richard Blackwood was walking in the right direction. 10 months after the pivotal board meeting, Richard Blackwood sat in the garden of his Hampton estate, watching as employees and their families enjoyed the company's annual summer picnic. Children raced across the immaculate lawn, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Adults gathered in small groups, conversations flowing easily without the tension that had once characterized any event where the notorious CEO might appear. From his vantage point beneath a maple tree, Richard observed the transformation not just of his company, but of the relationships within it. Caroline chatted animatedly with Elizabeth near the buffet tables. Timothy, home from his first year at Princeton, played touch football with interns and junior executives who would never have dared such familiarity in the past. "Quite a change from the corporate retreats you used to host," a familiar voice commented. Victor Harrington settled into the chair beside Richard, offering him a glass of lemonade. In the month since the board meeting, their relationship had evolved in unexpected ways. The initial hostility had given way to a wary collaboration, and more recently, to something approaching mutual respect. "I seem to recall those events involving a lot more alcohol and a lot less joy," Richard replied, with a wry smile, accepting the drink. "Thank you for organizing this, Victor. It's exactly what I envisioned." Victor nodded, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed the gathering. "I still don't fully understand your transformation, Richard, but I can't argue with the results." The results had indeed been remarkable. Under Victor's continued leadership, but with Richard's guidance, Blackwood Enterprises had implemented sweeping reforms. Worker conditions had improved, environmental standards had been raised, and the corporate culture had shifted from fear-based competition to collaborative excellence. Most surprisingly to the skeptics on the board, the company's stock had stabilized after an initial drop and was now showing steady, sustainable growth. Client relationships had deepened, employee retention had improved dramatically, and the company's reputation had begun a slow but definite rehabilitation. "How are you feeling?" Victor asked, his gaze falling to Richard's hands, which now trembled visibly most of the time. Richard sighed. The pretense of perfect health had become impossible to maintain months ago when he collapsed during a presentation to the Ethics Committee. The subsequent medical examinations had confirmed what he already knew. The neurological damage was progressive and irreversible. "I have good days and bad days," he answered honestly. "Today is one of the better ones." Victor nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further. "The Chicago deal closed yesterday. Using your approach of transparency and fair terms, we actually secured better conditions than we initially hoped. Thanks, because they trusted you weren't trying to exploit them," Richard observed. "Trust creates value in ways that force and manipulation never can." The conversation shifted to business matters, ongoing projects, upcoming challenges, strategic decisions that needed consideration. Richard listened more than he spoke, offering guidance when asked, but otherwise allowing Victor to demonstrate his growing comfort with the new corporate philosophy. As they talked, Richard noticed a small figure moving at the edge of the garden, partially hidden by flowering shrubs. A boy in a grey hoodie, watching the proceedings with those unmistakable, intense blue eyes. Richard's heart quickened, but he maintained his composure, not wanting to draw Victor's attention to the apparition. "Excuse me, Victor," he said when there was a natural break in the conversation. "I need to stretch my legs a bit." Victor helped him to his feet, steadying him as a momentary dizziness passed. "Don't overdo it. Elizabeth will have my head if you exhaust yourself at an event I organized." Richard smiled at the protective concern, another change in their relationship that would have been unimaginable a year ago. "I'll just walk to the rose garden and back. The exercise is good for me." He made his way slowly along the stone path that wound through the garden, using his cane more for genuine support now than as a precautionary measure. The boy remained visible, always at a distance, moving deeper into the property toward the secluded rose garden that had been Elizabeth's passion project for years. When Richard finally reached the garden, enclosed by high hedges and centered around a small fountain, the boy was waiting for him on a stone bench. Up close, he looked exactly as he had in the hospital room and at the lake house, ageless, serious, with that disconcerting wisdom in his young face. "Hello, Michael," Richard greeted, lowering himself carefully onto the bench beside the boy. "Hello, Richard," the boy replied. "You've been busy." Richard smiled. "Following doctor's orders. Your orders, specifically." "My suggestions," the boy corrected gently. "The choices were always yours." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the picnic and the closer burbling of the fountain. "You've done well," the boy finally said. "Better than I expected, to be honest." "High praise from an angel," Richard replied with a soft laugh. The boy's expression remained serious. "I'm not an angel, Richard." "Then what are you?" "I've had a lot of time to think about it, and that's the best explanation I can come up with. That or I've been hallucinating since I woke from the coma." "Does it matter what I am?" the boy asked. "Would it change what you've accomplished?" Richard considered this. "No, I suppose not, but I'd still like to know." The boy shrugged, a surprisingly childlike gesture from a being who seemed otherwise so old. "I'm a second chance, a redemption, a reminder of what could have been and what still can be. Beyond that, I'll leave the theological speculations to others." Richard nodded, accepting the non-answer. "How much time do I have left?" "Not long," the boy replied honestly. "The doctors suspect it, though their tests can't fully explain the acceleration of symptoms. 2 months, perhaps 3. Richard had expected this answer, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through him. "Enough time to finish what I've started." "That depends on how you define finished," the boy said. "Some of your work will continue long after you're gone. The foundations you've laid, the changes you've set in motion, those will outlast you." "And Victor? Can he be trusted to maintain the new direction?" The boy smiled faintly. "He's learning, just as you did. Your example has affected him more deeply than either of you realize." Richard glanced back toward the picnic, where he could see Victor now engaged in conversation with Timothy. "He has potential I never fully recognized. Too busy seeing him as a tool rather than a person with his own path." "A mistake you've corrected," the boy acknowledged. "One of many." Richard turned back to his mysterious companion. "There's still so much I haven't made right. So many people I hurt over the years." "You've done what you could with the time you had," the boy said gently. "Perfect redemption isn't possible in an imperfect world. What matters is that you tried, genuinely, honestly tried, to be better." "Because of you," Richard said. "Because you gave me a second chance." The boy shook his head. "I only showed you the door. You chose to walk through it." A wave of dizziness washed over Richard, stronger than before. He closed his eyes, waiting for it to pass. When he opened them again, the boy was standing before him, those blue eyes studying him with compassion. "It's getting worse," the boy observed. Richard nodded. "The headaches are almost constant now. The doctors have increased my medication, but it only dulls the pain." "Are you afraid?" the boy asked. Richard considered the question carefully. Not of dying, exactly. More of leaving things unfinished, of not having enough time to fully make amends. That's understandable, the boy said. But perhaps part of redemption is accepting our limitations, acknowledging that we can't fix everything we've broken. A humbling thought, Richard admitted. Humility was never your strong suit, the boy said with a small smile. Richard laughed softly. No, it wasn't. Along with compassion, patience, forgiveness, I had a lot to learn. And you learned it, the boy assured him. In the time that mattered most, the sound of someone. Approaching drew their attention. Elizabeth appeared at the entrance to the rose garden, her expression concerned. Richard, are you all right? You've been gone a while. Richard glanced at the boy, who nodded slightly in understanding. I'm fine, Elizabeth, he called. Just needed some quiet. I'll be there in a moment. Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. Don't be too long. Timothy wants to make an announcement before people start leaving. After she departed, Richard turned back to the boy. Will I see you again? Once more, the boy promised, when the time comes. Richard nodded, understanding the implication. Thank you, Michael, for everything. The boy placed his small hand on Richard's, and for a moment, the tremors stilled. We were friends once, Richard. The best of friends. I never stopped believing. In the good person I knew you could be. He stood, and that now familiar golden glow began to emanate from him. Go back to your family. Cherish the time you have left with them. That's the greatest redemption of all. Learning to love purely, without condition or expectation. Richard blinked against sudden tears, and when his vision cleared, the boy was gone. Only a slight depression in the grass where he had stood suggested he had been there at all. With effort, Richard rose and made his way back to the picnic. Elizabeth met him halfway, taking his arm to support him. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, studying his face with concern. Richard smiled. Not a ghost, an old friend. Timothy was waiting for them near the main gathering, his expression a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Beside him stood a young woman Richard recognized as Sophia Greenlake, Timothy's girlfriend from Princeton. There. You are, Dad, Timothy said. We've been waiting for you. Richard settled into his chair, Elizabeth standing supportively behind him. I believe you have an announcement. Timothy took Sophia's hand, their fingers intertwining. Sophia and I are engaged. We're planning a wedding for next June after graduation. A chorus of congratulations erupted from the gathered employees and family members. Richard watched his son's face, radiant with happiness, and felt a bittersweet pang. Next June. He wouldn't be there to see it. As if reading his thoughts, Timothy knelt beside his father's chair. I know what you're thinking, Dad, but you'll be there. One way or another, you'll be part of it. Richard embraced his son, holding him tightly. I'm so proud of you, he whispered, of the man you've become, despite my failures as a father. Timothy pulled back, his eyes bright with emotion. You showed me that it's never too late to change, to become better. That's a gift I'll carry my whole life. The celebration continued into the evening, with toasts to the engaged couple and impromptu dancing on the lawn as the sun began to set. Richard remained at the center of it all, conserving his energy but fully present in a way he had never been before his awakening. As twilight deepened, he found himself seated beside Elizabeth, watching the joyful scene before them. It's beautiful, isn't it? She said softly. All these people, happy together. No fear, no power games. Just genuine connection. Richard took her hand, noticing how she no longer flinched at his touch, as she once had during the worst years of his ruthless ambition. I wish I had understood sooner what really matters. All the time, I wasted chasing the wrong things. Don't, Elizabeth said gently. Don't regret. We're here now. That's what counts. Richard looked at his wife, really looked at her, appreciating the strength and grace that had allowed her to stay with him through his worst years and to believe in his transformation when most would have dismissed it as impossible. I never deserved you, he said simply. Elizabeth smiled. Perhaps not, but you became deserving. That's the miracle in all of this. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Richard gazed across the gathering, at Timothy and Sophia planning their future together, at Victor discovering a new kind of leadership based on respect rather than fear, at Caroline finally recognized for her true value to the company, at employees who now thrived in an environment of support rather than intimidation. This was his true legacy, he realized. Not the buildings that bore his name or the fortune he had amassed, but the lives he had touched and the changes he had set in motion. The ripples would continue long after he was gone, spreading outward in ways he could only imagine. A soft breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of roses and the distant sound of children's laughter. Richard closed his eyes, feeling a profound peace settle over him. Michael had been right. Redemption wasn't about perfection or even completion. It was about choosing a different path when given the chance, about remembering who you were meant to be before the world hardened your heart. In the fading light, Richard thought he glimpsed a small figure watching from the edge of the garden, a boy in a grey hoodie, smiling with approval before turning away. This time, Richard didn't feel urgency or desperation at the sight, only gratitude, and the quiet certainty that when the time came, they would meet again. For now, there was this moment, this gathering of people whose lives he had once controlled, through fear but who now chose freely to share their joy with him. There was his son, embarking on a future filled with promise. There was his wife, whose love had never faltered even when he had given her every reason to walk away. And there was Richard himself, no longer the ruthless titan of industry, but simply a man who had been given a second chance and had made the most of it. A man who had learned finally and just in time that true power came not from domination, but from compassion, not from control, but from connection. As the stars multiplied overhead and the celebration continued around him, Richard Blackwood embraced the precious gift he had been given